Hello and welcome to Can We Still Be Friends, a podcast that tests the limits of the friendship between two people who mistake movie taste for personal morality. I'm Nate Goss, here with Ryan Ebling. Our podcast was started from discussions Ryan and I would have about film, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes with other friends. There is one discussion that seems to keep coming up every so often. So seeing as this year is the 20th anniversary of the release of Pulp Fiction, we decided to bring that fight before you, our listeners, as we discuss the work of Quentin Tarantino.
That's right. Now, joining us today is our good friend and longtime moderator slash peacekeeper, our Jules, if you will, reminding us to be like a couple of Fonzies, Tim Yoder. Welcome, Tim.
Hello.
Now, when Pulp Fiction was released, it was a really huge moment in film. Tarantino was an utterly unique voice, and Pulp Fiction was a breath of fresh air, serving to spark several careers, as well as famously resurrecting John Travolta's career. Now, the merit of that act in and of itself is probably worthy of a debate, but however, even with that film being more or less universally lauded, Tarantino attracted a large amount of negative backlash, specifically for the violence in his films, as well as his really pretty cocky attitude that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
For better or worse, this has caused people to ask the question, is Tarantino a genius or just a button-pushing provocateur? But does he have to be one or the other? Can he be both? Can he be neither? Is there a real Tarantino? Which is the alter ego? Is he really Superman or is he really Clark Kent? With all these questions, it's good we brought back up.
If that song doesn't get you ready to talk about Tarantino, I don't think anything will.
No, I don't think so. Nothing will.
Yeah. So Tarantino, like we said, has a lot of violence. He's also pretty vulgar in his movies. So for this episode, we might be playing some clips from his movies, and it's very difficult to find a clip without swears or racial slurs.
Yeah.
So we know that you like to gather the family around the fire and turn on our podcast, but this one might be one that you listen to after the kids go to bed.
Yeah, I know they'll be disappointed, but just tell the kiddies it's okay. You'll catch the next one.
Yeah. Also, it should go without saying, we'll be talking about hopefully all of Tarantino's movies, and we may be talking about plot points that could be pivotal. So if you haven't seen the movies, all of the movies, I think you can still listen to it, but just know that we might be revealing some things that you wouldn't know.
Or just talking at a sort of detailed level that'll be more interesting if you've seen these movies. So make sure that you try to catch up with as many as you can before you dive into this episode.
But speaking from experience, I wouldn't watch them all in 1 week.
Yeah, we could talk about that later, but boy, what a week it's been.
Now, we mentioned our friend Tim Yoder is here with us. We've known Tim for a long time, since college, and we invited him along because we've talked about Tarantino amongst ourselves for many years now, and Tim's always been really insightful, and
we've even, I think, seen a couple movies with him in the theater, and
Right.
so it's been something that we've always kind of, it's been a very regular topic of conversation as Tarantino, and an interesting one. So it was really important to us to bring Tim on board.
yeah. So thanks for being here, Tim.
Glad to be here. Yeah, I think that a large part of the reason I've seen the last several Tarantino movies is because I saw them with Nate. And Nate's good company to see them in. The people you see Tarantino with is a large part of the experience. And I'm glad that I saw a lot of these in the theater, because I believe that having that as a context, I think there is something important about seeing them in the theater to understand what he's trying to do.
It's a lot about experience, I think, with Tarantino.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but for me, that actually ruined a few of the Tarantino movies that I saw in the theater.
Yeah.
But we won't get into that.
The plot thickens.
Yeah, the plot thickens a little bit. Yeah. But for now, let's talk about Pulp Fiction, because that's the reason we're talking about Tarantino. 20 years ago, in May, it premiered at Cannes. It didn't open in the U.S. until September. But it was really a landmark movie. And there's not really any debate amongst us as to whether or not we love Pulp Fiction or whether it's our favorite Tarantino. I think that goes without saying, right?
Yeah, I love Pulp Fiction, although I think it's interesting to talk about maybe when we saw it, because I certainly didn't see it when it had come out, or we were catching it later. And so I actually never did see it in the theater, even though we just talked about how important it is to see
Yeah.
a Tarantino film in the theater. But still, we found a way to love Pulp Fiction, even without that sort of Tarantino theater experience. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what our experience watching it and what we really liked about it, or what was so great about it.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first time I saw it was in college, and at the time, I actually have to admit I was a little bit frustrated because I had something I needed to be doing, and someone's like, "No, it's not that long." Well, it was a long movie.
It goes by quickly, but
it goes by
it still
quickly.
takes-
But also, when you're looking for those standard cues of how long is left in this movie, it doesn't have those cues.
Nope.
So I remember being a little irritated with the person who was making me watch it at the first time, but at the same time, it was a very affecting movie for.
It wasn't me that made you watch it, was
No,
it?
no, it
Okay.
wasn't. No, it was very affecting. I mean, I had not seen any other Tarantino at that point, so the level of violence, the level of stylization, it was not like anything I'd ever seen before.
Yeah. Go ahead, Nate.
Well, I was going to say, and I think that's an interesting point you make, because I feel like I saw this after there had already seeing some of the imitators of this.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, definitely.
And I would maybe at the top of that list, I might put something like Boondock Saints, or something like
Can I just quick ask what you mean top of the list?
of imitators.
Okay,
People-
like egregious imitation.
Yeah, maybe not egregious. I wouldn't go that far,
Oh,
but
gosh.
just
all right. Maybe we're gonna have to talk about Boondock Saints in the future.
well, we might not disagree. I don't really care that much for that movie. So all I'm saying.
I abhor that movie.
Oh, okay. I don't necessarily have the sour taste in my mouth for it as you do, but I guess I think I was also in college, or maybe even post college, when I had seen it for the first time. Really sat down and watched it. My parents had rented it one time, and I caught clips as I kind of snuck my head around the living room because it seemed like a very curious movie. But they did not want me watching that movie, so anything I saw was something they didn't know about. But when I watched it later on, it was kind of like, oh, this is where it all began. This is where things like Boondock Saints and what else would you put on that? Maybe Snatch and Lock, Stock and those movies too, a little bit.
A lot of movies that came and went and have faded.
Right.
Like there's a lot of imitators, but it's also kind of tough to pinpoint a bunch of them.
Exactly. And I think once you see Pulp Fiction, though, those movies really do kind of they lose a lot of their luster. They completely seem. It's not necessarily that they're ripping it off entirely, but it's kind of like no one does it like Tarantino. You can try as hard as you want, but you're not gonna really succeed at creating a Tarantino-esque movie if you're not Quentin Tarantino.
Definitely.
And so, Pulp Fiction to me was more a revelation, just in the sense of, oh, this is the way that type of thing, that sort of snappy, the strange editing choices, the sort of cool, the oozing of the cool, the ultra violence, all those elements kind of thrown into the pot. This is how it's done, and just being wowed by that.
Yeah, I agree. I saw it in high school, but I had seen imitators before I saw it, that sort of thing. And I think that really speaks to the power of Pulp Fiction, that you watch it in light of imitators and say, this is how it was supposed to be done. Whereas so often you watch a movie and you can say, I can see how this was important at the time.
Right.
But, other movies have taken this and run with it. Nobody has been able to run with what Tarantino has done. And Pulp Fiction, I think Pulp Fiction is the pinnacle of it. I think he's hit some highs with his other movies, but I don't think he's ever going to create a movie like Pulp Fiction again. And I can only imagine how much more I would have loved Pulp Fiction if I had seen it in 1994.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was 10. So if it were like literally me seeing it in 1994, I probably would have been scarred. But if I could have been, like an adult in 1994 seeing Pulp Fiction for the first time, I can't imagine how shockingly amazing that would have been.
I feel like even as I was reading through this week, I was reading a few of critics reminiscing about the first time they saw it a lot of them were at Cannes, and they couldn't even seem to put into words. It seemed like they were struggling to really convey how important this was, how strange it was, how, even how disruptive it was.
Yeah, and another thing I was going to say that speaks to the power of Pulp Fiction, it was parodied and referenced to no end. Before I ever saw it, I knew scenes, I knew lines, I knew all this stuff. And those scenes and those lines did not lose their power at all when I saw it. Even though I'd known the references, I'd known all those things, it just hits you as brand new every time.
Well, you had mentioned, Ryan, that you said that you felt like he never really did hit that was the pinnacle of what he's done, and he hasn't seemed to have hit that on the same level since. Maybe that would be a good time to actually bring in our poll, because the poll was related to that question, actually, of the way we phrased it was we actually pretty much assumed that everyone was going to choose Pulp Fiction as their favorite movie of Tarantino's.
Yeah.
And so we basically said, other than that, you can't choose Pulp Fiction. What would you choose as your favorite Tarantino movie?
Maybe we shot ourselves in the foot by qualifying it like that, because
we didn't get a ton of a participation in this one.
Right.
Okay, let's go over the results real quick. So, other than Pulp Fiction, what is your favorite Tarantino film? A couple of movies that we didn't get a single vote for. Jackie Brown, unfortunately. I really like that movie.
It's a good movie.
I think it's just a movie people forgot about or haven't seen, but you should watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't get a single vote for Death Proof. And we also didn't get a single vote for Django Unchained, which is kind of surprising considering that's the most recent. And it seemed like a lot of people really liked that movie when they saw it. So the first Tarantino movie that actually got a vote in this poll was Reservoir Dogs with 11%, and it actually tied though with Inglourious Bastards. So 11% each for those movies. And then we've got coming up next 22% for Kill Bill Volume 1. And then closely related to that, with the sort of the by far the winner of this poll, even though it's a very small sample size, we've got 56%. So more than half of our listeners who took part in this poll voted for Kill Bill Volume 2 as their favorite Tarantino movie, sans Pulp Fiction. So a couple things that come to my mind looking at that is I wonder, looking at the fact that Kill Bill, both of them actually kind of ran away with this, do you see it as one film? I know Tarantino sees it as one film. He actually didn't even want to have it split up, from what I understand. And even when you talk to him, I read an interview with him in the New York Times from last year, where he said that he doesn't even consider them two films when he counts the number of films he's made. He counts them as one film.
I can understand that. They aren't so different that I, wouldn't be able to say that. What do you think, Tim? Is that...
Well, one thing I feel when it comes to them as possibly two different films is that they seem to be referencing very different things. And that lends to them having a very different feel.
Yeah, the first one's more of a kung fu movie. The second one is more of a Western, sort of, as far as...
More of a Western. It's got some references to Shogun Assassin.
Yeah.
But it's less of a Bruce Lee movie and more of a Western, more of a... It's hard to say.
Yeah, one of the older, less like episodic Japanese films.
And I think, another thing that really struck me as different between the two films when I watched them, and not to jump a topic, but Kill Bill Volume 1 is definitely a revenge film through and through. And you don't realize until the very end of it that the object of revenge is not what it was thought to be.
Right. And
so by the end of the first movie, we as the audience know that she has a daughter to rescue, and that there's something beyond just the revenge motivation to drive that second movie. To me, it felt a lot less bleak.
For sure.
And in the way I approach it. And that definitely colored the way I approached the second movie.
And it actually colored the way I viewed the first movie, because I think I'm fine with them being two separate movies, because I think they're pretty different tonally, like we said, in references and things. But you also have, without the second, you're right, the first is just kind of bleak, empty violence. But the second really brings it all together, which is, for me, if we can talk about, I voted for Volume 2 as my favorite beyond Pulp Fiction, because that's where the first one found its footing, kind of grounded it. And I think I just enjoyed the second one more. That's not to say I didn't love like the fights and stuff about the first one, but in the second one, I really appreciated the development of the bride as a character and Bill as a character, and it kind of put the rest of the people that she had already taken her revenge on in a different light.
Right.
The second one just opens up the first one for me.
Yeah. And actually, I also voted for Kill Bill Volume 2. And I am going to add some qualifiers that I know our listeners can't, though, and say that this is actually, I think, the hardest poll I've had to answer that we've done so far. The other ones I kind of felt like I knew how I was going to answer right away. What I've come to notice as I've watched a lot of these movies over again and thought about how I feel about Tarantino is that the level of difference as far as my feelings towards all of his movies, his entire canon, there's not any that I love or dislike a lot more than the others. It was a lot of very, very fine shades between them as far as how I feel. And I voted for Kill Bill Volume 2 mostly just because I did kind of consider them as one piece. And I thought as one piece, I know we couldn't say that in the poll, so I apologize if that's what you wanted to say too, and you couldn't vote that way if you're a listener. But I kind of consider them as one piece, and Volume 2, I agree with Ryan, it's kind of where it all comes together and makes the first one all that more better.
And I actually think that's why I voted for Volume 2, because I saw them as one piece, and 2, like I said, brings one, it elevates one for me.
Now, I will say, though, that I was juggling back and forth between that and actually Django Unchained was the other one that I was kind of weighing which one am I going to vote for. I could have shaken it up a bit probably by voting for Django, but I kind of had to go with what I, at the end of the day, really felt was the one that I just enjoyed the most watching, and for me it was Kill Bill Volume 2.
Well, it's interesting, too, that when you consider them in light of each other, I took a little bit of liberty to consider Volume 1 in light of Volume 2. And at the time that I watched them, I definitely enjoyed Volume 2 more because, like I said, it felt like there was a better motivation driving it. But looking back, having Volume 2 in mind, knowing how everything's going to resolve, I voted for Volume 1 because of certain elements that I thought were just incredibly executed, particularly the incredibly long shot in the Crazy 88 scene.
Oh my gosh, the Crazy 88 fight scene is one of the greatest things you'll see, I think.
Absolutely.
Not just fight scene, it's incredible.
And it's one of those things that only Tarantino could have executed.
Yep.
And I had only actually rewatched that. I had only seen it originally when it first came out, and then I rewatched it for this podcast, and I think I forgot how much fun it is to watch Volume 1 of Kill Bill.
Yeah,
it is such a fun movie. And even I kind of had forgotten a lot of how much I like the animation sequences in it, which were great, and the way that they seamlessly worked into the movie. It's just unlike anything you'll see, I think. And I mean, other than if you're going to actually watch a lot of these original kung fu movies he's referencing, but even still, that referential sort of treatment of those is just so interesting and fun to watch.
Yeah, definitely. And now that brings me to a point I wanted to discuss. Kill Bill is incredibly violent. I mean, incredibly bloody, and limbs getting hacked off here and there, and in the animated sequence, there's crazy amounts of blood and things like that. And I'm still able to describe it as fun and really enjoy that movie. I feel like, I don't know if he was going for the same sort of tone, but in Death Proof and Inglourious Bastards, I really rejected the idea that I was supposed to be having any fun with the violence in those two movies. And I don't know if you guys felt the same way, if you guys have responded to the violence in other movies of his similarly, or what do you think the difference could be?
I don't know if fun's the right word. I mean, fun is the right word for Kill Bill. Absolutely. But Kill Bill's violence is, not even so much Volume 2, but Volume 1 of Kill Bill is and especially the blood in particular. I mean, he hasn't really treated blood that way in any other movie where you're hacking off a limb and it's just a fountain of blood spurting out. I mean, that is a stylistic choice that is sort of the director manipulating you to say it's okay to have fun with this. Okay, I think he's giving you that permission, and I think he's doing, actually, in my opinion, he's doing a fine job of that. It's so over the top that you're not going to have a problem. Well, I didn't have a problem with that, having fun and that kind of violence. When you move over into Inglourious Bastards and Death Proof, I don't know that he's trying to evoke the same exact feeling that he is in Kill Bill Volume 1.
No, I agree. I don't think he's trying to do the same exact. Like
But are you having trouble with the sort of how flippant he is with it in those? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and over the top. And here's the thing: I mentioned before that I think seeing some of the movies in the theater ruined the experience. And Inglourious Bastards, definitely. Rewatching Inglourious Bastards, I realized that he has two ways of depicting the violence. That there is some that you are supposed to, not in the same way, but still have fun, enjoy, and revel in a little bit. The final scene where they're shooting up the theater. Mm-hmm. I think you're supposed to be enjoying it. And that's over the top. And like that shot of shooting Hitler just from close range with a machine gun, I was really uncomfortable with the fact that the audience I saw it with, in any depiction of violence, they went into this movie thinking, Quentin Tarantino, I'm going to have fun with this movie. And from the first time that a gun is fired, when they shoot into the floorboards of the house, the audience was rolling. And I was so offended by that, that the rest of the movie, anytime that violence in that movie seemed like it was supposed to be enjoyable, I just couldn't hang with it. And I know I can't fault Tarantino for that audience's reaction, but I kind of can, because he has created this persona where violence is something that's going to be awesome. Like, let me show you this, and it's so cool. He
thinks violence is cool. I mean, he said that over and over and over again in his interviews. But I do think that he also has this element where he, as a moviegoer, he embraces the idea that the director's job is to manipulate the audience. That he likes that idea. You know, he had a quote in an article that I was reading where he basically said, I feel like a conductor and the audience's feelings are my instruments. I will be like, laugh, laugh, now be horrified. When someone does that to me, I've had a good time at the movies. Okay, so he definitely is trying to pull your strings as you're watching that. Now, I think that in the instance you gave in Inglourious Bastards, that to me sounds like he didn't do a very good job pulling those strings, because I don't think he meant for you to laugh when they're getting shot up in the floorboards. I don't think so either. I think you're supposed to be horrified by that. Right. Then later on in that movie, when they're shooting up the theater and they're burning the theater and all that kind of stuff, and you're seeing Hitler's face getting shot off and all that stuff, I can completely understand being uncomfortable with that, and I think that is worthy to talk about, of whether we should actually be okay with the idea of Hitler's face getting shot off and just supposed to enjoy that. Okay, that is a discussion I hope that we can have in this podcast. But as far as how it pertains to violence, I mean, I just think that he is stylistically doing it in such a way where he knows exactly what feelings he wants to pull out of you from the audience, and in that case, he did want people to enjoy that.
Well, and I think one thing to bring into this too is, I think it's interesting he talks about his experience as an audience member as the foundation for why he does what he does, and that makes it worthwhile to bring in that he's referencing other things. And I think that has something of an influence on this sort of split between you're supposed to enjoy this and you're supposed to be horrified by this. Is that, you know, two of the major things he's major streams that he's bringing in. Number one, in Grindhouse, he is talking about exploitation films. And, you know, he brings in a lot of exploitation, a lot of ethnic exploitation. And in those cases, violence is meant to shock. And it's meant to flaunt, you know, we're outside the Hays Code. We're doing things that you couldn't see before, and we're sensationalizing everything. In Kill Bill, one of his major influences is Shogun Assassin. And a lot of the sights of arteries spurting this not very convincing blood, but absolute fountains of it, is coming from an older Japanese film that is also a revenge film that has a child involved. And in that case, the connection between the blood and the ultra violence is that you're rooting for a protagonist. And as you're seeing him decapitate, the Shogun Assassin was the decapitator for the Shogun. And now that he's been persecuted, and his wife has been killed. That's another problematic sort of theme that is going to follow us. Because his wife's
female's there to
fridged,
be killed,
basically.
too, right?
She's not a character. She's just killed in order to provide a motivation. Nonetheless, though, when we see people violently decapitated, we know that the person we're rooting for is making it, and we can kind of revel in the fact that the double cross isn't working.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when we switch into Grindhouse, we're also dealing with a level of ultra violence, but it's serving a very different end. And I think the two get conflated pretty easily. And especially a less reflective audience is going to mix them up.
Yeah, and I think even on Tarantino's part, I've noticed that there seems to be a shift, not in the violence itself and the gruesomeness of it. I think he's had that all along. I mean, even Reservoir Dogs, you see the ear getting, so we're not talking about has he gotten more violent over the years? You
don't see the ear getting cut off.
No, you see it afterwards.
There's a lot of stuff. That's one thing that
he shies away from it actually being cut off.
I don't know if it's shying away. I think it makes it more effective, because instead of showing you something, he is almost making you fill in the gaps and imagine it. So instead of showing it and running the risk of somebody not being grossed out or somebody being too grossed out, he implies it, and then you fill in what you think is the worst thing happening. And that's why scenes early on, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, people remember these scenes as being so excruciating and gruesome,
right?
When you didn't see it. You don't.
But they're serving different purposes in that movie. The violence, and this is what I was going to say, is that after, I think, post Jackie Brown, so starting with Kill Bill.
I think that's an important distinction to make, yeah.
Post Jackie, I think we could actually split it between the two sort of Tarantino eras. Definitely. And I think the big point is that the violence serves a different purpose. In the first few movies, and I think this has to do with Tarantino's worlds that he presents in each movie. In the first two movies, the worlds he presents are much more nuanced. It's not a black and white world. Whereas when you get past that and you start moving into Kill Bill, Death Proof, Inglourious Bastards, Django, so on, it's usually has something to do with vengeance, or you have a very clear protagonist and they have a clear-cut goal that they need to get through, or a group of protagonists in the case of Inglourious Bastards. And the violence is a cathartic thing in those movies. There's no cathartic violence in Reservoir Dogs or in Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
Now, that I think is a very important thing to discuss as a viewer, is if that's appropriate, if it's appropriate to have cathartic violence of that nature, and for you as an audience member to glory in that. But the point is, I think that the violence itself is not serving the same purpose in those early Tarantino movies. And the violence only works, if it works at all, it only works because the worlds he paints in those other later films are so black and white. Yeah. The justice is so black and white. You have a clear-cut good guy, a clear-cut bad guy, and so we want to see that bad guy eventually get his comeuppance.
Yeah, and that's one thing that frustrates me about those movies, is that it feels like he uses that as an excuse. You say, well, I think that's too violent. Like, is there anything that's too violent for, Nazis, for slave owners? Like, perpetuating violence against these... to me, it feels like he uses that black and whiteness to get away with a lot and to wash his hands of any responsibility. Say, like, listen, man, I'm just trying to make things right by giving these, put upon people this extremely violent justice.
And I think it's problematic that
I do too.
He utterly conflates justice and retribution.
Absolutely.
And there is no solid reflection on the even mention that those two could be separate concepts.
Right. And it also frustrates me because he explored those issues so well in Pulp Fiction, especially.
Which issues exactly?
The idea of what is justice, what is retribution, specifically the scene where Butch makes his way out from the pawn shop basement and he grabs the keys to the chopper, goes outside, looks at it, realizes he can't leave without saving Marcellus Wallace. In the world of Tarantino post Jackie Brown, Marcellus Wallace would meet a violent end because he was the one, he had wronged Butch, whatever, Like, I feel like he would have done something to make Marcellus Wallace a much more one-dimensional character and would have met some sort of violent end.
So we cool? Yeah, we cool. Two things. Don't tell nobody about this. This shit is between me, you, and Mr. Soon-to-be living the rest of his short-ass life in agonizing pain rapist here. It ain't nobody else's business. Two, you leave town tonight, right now. And when you're gone, you stay gone, or you be gone. You lost all your LA privileges, deal?
I mean, this is all
But that's the point, though, I think.
I also, what do you mean? What?
The point is that in those, the difference is that in Pulp Fiction, he didn't paint Marcellus Wallace that way. In the later films,
That's
he
what
would.
Yeah, and I'm saying that's what frustrates me more about the later films is because he's shown that he can be so thoughtful, and then it just feels to me lazy that he's not
Is
trying.
it laziness or is it just a different intent?
Whatever, maybe it is, but the fact that he hasn't since Kill Bill tried to go back to anything like that, I feel like it's a little bit of like he's not taking responsibility for anything. Like I said, he's washing his hands of any responsibility in depiction or whatever. Mm-hmm. And let me go back to Pulp Fiction and say about that scene, from like a biblical sort of Christian standpoint, I don't know if this was intentional, but when Butch walks out and sees the chopper, he goes out and sees the word, I don't know if, intentionally sees the word grace written on this motorcycle. And then he turns around and goes back. Mm-hmm. And picks his weapon, whatever, back to Tarantino-ishness with the violence. But to me, that Pulp Fiction is a very redemptive movie. Mm-hmm. It's all about people getting redeemed. Not everybody, because it's not the way it works. Unfortunately, Vincent Vega doesn't get redeemed, but he also didn't really have anything to be saved from, sort of. But then you got Jules, who makes that switch, and he passes on redemption and grace to Pumpkin and Honey Bunny. And that, to me, is one of the reasons I love Pulp Fiction, because it's so emotionally and philosophically dense. Mm-hmm. And that's what frustrates me, like I said, about the later stuff, is that he just abandons any thought of that. I think Kill Bill still has that. And if I may, I found a David Foster Wallace quote that I think articulates, if it makes sense, what I think about Tarantino. And David Foster Wallace says, "I'm not saying I'm able to work consistently out of the premise, but it seems like the big distinction between good art and so-so art lies somewhere in the art's heart's purpose, the agenda of the consciousness behind the text. It's got something to do with love, with having the discipline to talk out of the part of yourself that can love instead of the part that just wants to be loved." Now, I think that last line is like really spot on with Tarantino. He really wants you to like his movie and enjoy it. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying he's shying away from any nuance and gray area because he doesn't want the audience to lose his point. Yeah,
I can see what you're saying at a degree. I guess I feel like I always come back to, especially with these later films, I come back to what is Tarantino really trying to do. And I do think that there's a disappointment there because there isn't going to be, in these later films, there's not a whole lot of range, actually, and I think that honestly, this is why personally, I don't really ever put Tarantino in that same level as I put someone like, P.T. Anderson or Terrence Malick or Kubrick, because he's so style over substance. Well, and he always has been. I mean, actually, you can make a point for Pulp Fiction. That's when
Pulp Fiction is the marriage of style and substance.
We are not going to argue about whether the Pulp Fiction has merit or not. I mean, we agree. We agree on Pulp Fiction. The thing that where the differences lie is that I'm willing to accept in the later movies that style over substance and just kind of escape in that, because I think that's what he wants. I don't think this is the thing. What do we go to at this point?
Well, that's why I'm saying
what do we go to in
between
Tarantino?
Good art and so-so art. I'm saying that's why his later movies are just so-so movies, whereas Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, the Kill Bills are great movies.
Yeah, I mean, but you can approach art in different ways. I mean, I think on a macro, big global level of art, is this a great piece of art? Is it a masterpiece? Or is it just so-so? I agree. I don't think Tarantino's really hit a masterpiece level since Pulp Fiction, but I think it's still great art, because even if you just look at it from not just even just a technical level, but just at what does it succeed at what he's trying to do, I think it does. And if that's the artist's intent,
I guess I'm just not hanging with what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't think you have to, and I actually don't think even Tarantino says that you have to. I think he accepts the fact that there are going to be people who just don't care for his movies. But I think that he never reaches the level of, say, Scorsese or any of these masters, in my opinion, because he lacks that range, and he also lacks sincerity, I think. Like in these later films, especially, he says, I was reading yet another article where he had said that his two most emotional films that he's made were the Kill Bill movies, which he counts as one, and Jackie Brown. Okay, so that's his idea of an emotional movie. You know, certainly I had feelings as I watched that movie, but never to the level that you have when you watch something done that, like when Scorsese's on top of his game, when P.T. Anderson's on top of his game, like the level of just emotion and at a deeper level, the heart that I think you're talking about with David Foster Wallace, Tarantino never hits that. And I think that's why he's important. I enjoy going to his movies. He's a ton of fun, but that's what I'm looking for in a Tarantino movie. I'm not looking for much else, honestly, and I'm not expecting it at this point.
Well, let me just say that, to say that Quentin Tarantino could speak out of a place that can love is kind of maybe not exactly the right thing, but something that taps into human emotion. I would say that the Kill Bills are actually quite emotional movies, especially because in the end, Volume 2, she realizes that she wasn't going to be satisfied with revenge. What was important, what satisfied her, was that not just seeing that her daughter was alive, but also the discussion she had with Bill. It kind of buried the hatchet. He still ended up dying, but the reason she was satisfied is because they had that talk.
No. You're not a bad person. You're a terrific person. You're my favorite person. But every once in a while, you can be a real cunt.
And that's why that movie is so much more talking than fighting, for a very important reason. I think pointedly so. Because he's saying and realizing that reconciliation is more important than revenge. And there are... in that movie, when she's outside Bud's RV waiting to kill him, Bud puts on a record, and it's Johnny Cash's version of A Satisfied Mind. And Tarantino goes so far as to restart the song.
Right. In case you didn't get it.
In case you didn't get it, this song is about the rich man. A rich man by far is the one with a satisfied mind. And that I would actually say that the Kill Bills are very emotional, even though there is that, ultra violence for so long. Ultimately, it's all about the reconciliation.
I just think at the end of the day, he's always going to trump emotion with cool.
He is now.
If he's going to, I think
before he had cool with emotion.
But even still, there were issues like in the scene where Butch goes to save Marcellus Wallace. I still think it's a very problematic thing, the way that he has to save him from. There's a lot of shock going on there, and beyond that, it's perpetuating, really negative homosexual stereotypes.
That's true.
In order to get a shock value, so that when he does save him, you see him humiliated, Marcellus Wallace humiliated in a very particular way. I think the seed of the problem has always been there, even if it has occurred in films that had more to redeem them.
That's a good point. And that actually brings to mind one of the reasons I really hate Death Proof. I won't watch that movie again. I didn't want to watch it again for this. And I guess it was just less obvious with Marcellus Wallace. That Death Proof, it feels to me, he was trying to bring it all together with some female empowerment message. But when you spend 2/3 of the movie terrorizing, objectifying, belittling, and victimizing women, are we supposed to be happy that they get 20 minutes of whatever redemption, so to speak?
Yeah,
I think it's just more they get the final word.
That's true, but they're I've such a hard time with somebody who says oh, but yeah, this is about whatever, revenge or empowerment or redeeming somebody, when the only reason they needed that is because you chose to put them through this really gruesome process.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that might go back to what Tim was saying though about what he's really referencing, and I know that Tim, me and you we saw Grindhouse as Grindhouse. We went and saw the double feature with Planet Terror, and then watching Death Proof, and also we saw the Death Proof in the theater, which was actually much shorter than the one you're going to get now on DVD because it had these really funny, actually missing reels. It actually had these sort of jumps in continuity because of the way you watched it, and that is certainly a movie that is style over substance from the beginning.
It is only style.
And I like it for that. I think that what it's throwing back to, which actually goes back to our Gremlins conversation of like these sort of B movies, the so bad it's good. Even the acting is performed much more flat in it than it is in any of his other movies, intentionally. So everything he does, I think, is intentional. And I don't think it's his strongest movie, and I don't think he even thinks it's his strongest movie at all.
You think it's not his weakest?
Like I said, I go back to what I said in the poll. I have a really hard time ranking Tarantino.
We're going to talk about Tarantino interviews. He said that Death Proof is his worst movie.
Well, he also said, I've heard him say that. I've also heard him say that he never wants to get any lower than Death Proof. Like he's kind of hit his low point with that.
Didn't it seem
but he
like
still said he loves it. He still said he loves Death Proof.
Did you rewatch it?
Yeah, I did.
I did not.
Okay.
Part of the reason is what I saw him and Rodriguez doing in the Grindhouse films was less of something that was supposed to be inspired by the Grindhouse and more a direct homage to it.
Exactly.
And to me, the idea of it is that they're supposed to be very disposable, low entertainments. And so the fact that we saw those movies starting at 10 o'clock at night and walked out at 1 a.m. in a cheap and decaying theater kind of felt to me like that was the experience I was supposed to have, and I was never really supposed to think that much more on it.
Exactly, and I think that's exactly what I was thinking as well, and I was really disappointed actually because I thought they missed the entire point when they even released them separately on DVD. It didn't make any sense to me. Where I think Death Proof's biggest weaknesses is actually just in some of the dialogue getting too long, even by Tarantino's standards. Like it's just getting boring. And I don't think that the Zoe Bell, amazing scenes at the end with her doing the ship's mast thing or whatever they call it on top of the hood of the car. I mean, that is just a ton of fun to watch. It's a great way to end the movie. But she's not a very good actress.
No.
And the other girl she plays off with, I don't know her name. She's also from New Zealand, I think, in the movie. And I just find a lot of the dialogue in that second half really tedious. Although in the first half, though, where they're at the bar in Austin and you're introducing Stuntman Mike, also the style cinematically is much more Grindhouse.
Yeah,
it's much
really seemed to abandon it.
He abandons it in the second half.
He doesn't do it's not like torn up, it's not cut. Like, I don't know why he did that.
I don't either, because I think it still would have been just as cool in the second half too.
Well, it would have made it seem less arbitrary.
Yeah.
Made the movie seem more thought out and cohesive. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I can't forgive that movie's treatment of women. And the fact that the friends leave that friend in the cheerleader outfit, Lee is her name. Just that is so offensive to me. I hate it. It makes me so mad that he did that.
Yeah.
And left her. They never go back. They never, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They just leave her there for this guy to essentially to sexually assault her.
Yeah.
With that thought in mind. Not with the possibility or the danger, with the thought that he will do that. I hate it. I hate it so much.
I think that's I agree. I mean, I agree that it's irresponsible to leave a girl alone with it, but I just think that if it's homage and those movies have always been chauvinistic,
well,
that's just part of it. I mean,
why do we have to celebrate it and redo it? That's the sort of thing that you move on and forget. Like, don't forget, but don't do it again. I would feel like if you're going to make a Grindhouse movie, and maybe it would have felt inauthentic to him, but then modernize it in a way that, like, hey, remember how fun this was without the really questionable morality and dangerous sort of mindset it's perpetuating.
Yeah, I don't know what that movie would look like. It's hard. We can't we
Oh, well,
can't
I understand
hypothesize
that.
what that would look like. Although I just wonder if it would soften it. That these movies are not well thought out. There are things in it that are obviously from the director's somewhat deranged mind, whether it's Tarantino's or just the people he's referencing, and that taking some of that stuff out would soften the entire feeling that he's trying to evoke when you're going to see it as a double feature in the theater. I don't know that I really enjoyed the movie as much watching it at home this second time around. Although I do think Death Proof of all of his movies has some of the most awesome music choices. The closing credits are just, he has a way sometimes with music to where even if you aren't totally on board with the movie, the song kicks in and you're like, oh yeah, this is great. And that's actually what happened with Death Proof. It basically ends with, stuntman Mike getting a boot to the face, and then it kicks into this do-do-do-do.
Hang up the tick, have it, hang it up, daddy, or you'll be alone in a quick. Hang up the tick, have it, hang it up, daddy, or you'll never get.
It's just like, all right, I didn't know how I felt about that.
But it doesn't let you think about it.
No, it
Don't
doesn't.
dwell on
That's
it.
the point. It doesn't let you think about it. But I don't go to his movies to think.
Yeah.
It's all about feeling. And if I'm getting the feeling he wants me to get out of it, it's escapism. I plug into that for the 2.5, 3 hours he gives me, and I pull right out of it. And I don't really think about it again after that.
See, that's what I think is it makes. This might
It's
seem
dangerous, I know.
counterintuitive. It
And
makes
Tarantino,
to
that's
me,
why you can't
to me,
imitate
if you
him.
are making a movie that is to be thoughtless and you're supposed to let it flow through you, then you need to be extra careful about the ideas you're putting forth, because then that's just you are equating really cool action scene, let's just enjoy it, with offering your friend up for rape. Like, that movie doesn't ask you to make distinctions between those things in your mind.
That is probably, to me, his most problematic film. What the playbook seemed to be as far as cultural engagement in Grindhouse was, we're just going to portray this exactly as it was, and hopefully someone's modern sensibilities brought to it is going to see how crazy it is. Such as, we got a lot out of the trailers in between that kind of reinforced that theme. I don't think enough commentary is given on it. I think it is problematic.
Yeah, which is, again, this came up with Gremlins, where if you do something well, I get more frustrated when you don't do something well. Jackie Brown is a strong female character, and she doesn't have to be horribly victimized to become a strong character.
Mm-hmm.
She just is.
Presents herself as that, and it's taken as,
Yes.
as a fact.
And I think The Bride, her victimization wasn't just because she was a woman. So that's another reason that Death Proof just makes me so much more frustrated, because he had done it and he just keeps dumbing himself down.
Yeah, but he's also not the kind of filmmaker I would count out as... I feel like once he gets kind of done dealing with something he wants to deal with, he moves on.
That's true.
So, I feel like right now we're just kind of in the middle of this. He's really into revenge, and he has been for a while. That's basically a revenge or vengeance or retribution, that kind of thing, and dealing with it in a very simplistic, almost... I don't think that he's ever saying that what is happening is necessarily in the real world the appropriate way to respond. In fact, he draws a very, very large distinction between cinema and the real world. He does not see a correlation at all between the two. We have a clip actually of him being interviewed. He was interviewed by Terry Gross on Fresh Air, and she asked him exactly this, and it was in light of Django and the Sandy Hook massacre. And he talks exactly about how he does not see a connection between the real world and the cinema world. So let's just listen to that for just a second.
Well, I
So
think
I
when
pulled
you're
it back
watching
a
the
little
film, the audience isn't thinking like you're thinking, because you're thinking like there's the reality violence and then there's the fun genre violence.
Oh, I think they are. I think they are.
Yeah?
I totally think they are. Yeah. Yeah, I totally think they are. One, there's the violence that's hard to watch, and there's the violence that's fun to watch. I think they're totally thinking that.
So I just have to ask you, is it any less fun after, like, the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary? Like, do you ever go through a period where you lose your taste for movie violence? And movie violence is not real violence. I understand the difference. but still, are there times when it just is not a fun movie experience for you, either to be making it that way or to be in the audience for something like that?
Not for me.
So it's so completely separate that the reality of violence doesn't affect at all your feelings about making or viewing very violent or sadistic.
Do you mean on that day would I watch The Wild Bunch? Maybe not on that day.
Or in the next few days, like while it's still really fresh in your while the reality.
Would I watch a kung fu movie 3 days after the Sandy Hook massacre? Would I watch a kung fu movie? Maybe, because they have nothing to do with each other.
You sound annoyed that
Yeah,
I know you've been asked this a lot.
Yeah, I'm really annoyed. I've been asked this question for 20 years.
Which question?
About the effects of violence in movies relating to violence in real life. And my answer is the same 20 years ago. It hasn't changed one iota.
And it's the answer you just gave?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I don't know what I just said, but obviously I don't agree. I don't think one has to do with the other.
Okay, so, in that clip, you can see he's actually getting a little bit annoyed because he feels like he shouldn't have to answer this over and over and over again, because to him, it's very cut and dry. Movie violence is movie violence. Real life violence is real life violence. They're not the same thing.
Now, this might sound like I'm contradicting myself. I agree with some of his points there. I kind of agree with his annoyance that it's in the wake of those things that we look to movies and TV to blame, rather than, like he said, realistic engagements with gun control and how mental health issues are handled and that sort of thing. But what I wonder then is what I was talking about with Death Proof, the rape culture, with the attitudes toward women, that sort of thing. Would he completely separate those from real life? Because I feel like those perpetuate a mindset.
I agree. Well, one thing too that I have to bring in when it comes to his treatment of violence and revenge as a valid motivator is that there's not really a live option in the hands of most people of, am I going to watch a violent movie and then do a violent act? For the most part, people know how to make that separation. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of discussion as to whether, we emulate that or we use it as catharsis. Maybe violence makes society less violent. I don't think there's any way to resolve that. But what really concerns me about the portrayal of violence in particular and revenge in particular is that there are choices that we make. Every person makes as a citizen in a democracy, in a free society, that I do think that his portrayal of revenge and violence can culture, or can influence. So, examples of this would be when we're deciding, how to vote in the wake of terrorist acts.
Yeah.
In the wake of, are we going to engage a war of revenge? That's a thing that a decision you have to make based on values. And I think you'd be hard pressed to say you're not influenced by the media, by the stories you consume, by the stories you live your life through. I think it's hard to say that Tarantino doesn't make revenge more normal and more okay for the average person to pursue by these very distant proxies. And so, other examples, what do we do when it comes to how we pursue crime? Do we show grace? Do we show mercy, or do we pursue revenge? Do we wrong the wrongers? And whatever your view on the death penalty is, I think that this sort of thing unconsciously colors the way you approach the value of human life.
There are so many different facets, I think, to the discussion of violence in movies and real life violence and their connection that I think is really what is missing in a lot of the discussion. It's basically like there's a lot of violence in this movie, so does that correlate to violence in real life? Well, it's not only about how the violence is portrayed, it's also what are the motivations behind that violence, exactly what you're saying. So what I think is what I could see Tarantino getting very annoyed about is you know, he's showing this violence, but it's almost like we aren't even talking about why the violence is there. We're just talking about the violence being there.
Yeah, yeah. It's a nebulous concept
yeah,
that we can
and
point to.
It's such a complicated thing. I feel like we're all going to, in some degree, contradict our own selves in what we've already said in this podcast. Because I can say that I totally agree with what you're saying. That I don't think that there's absolutely no effect on the culture when you have this in the mainstream media. But I can also say that I completely agree with Tarantino that like there's a way that you can separate yourself from that, and it does take a little bit of he has to, and I don't know. This is maybe he's most irresponsible in having a little bit too much faith in his audience. Do you think that they'll be able to do that?
I think because I think he's a very intelligent moviegoer, right? He is able to, on the fly, think about those genre films in a way that a lot of people aren't, and he can dissociate, which I think is some sophistication. He can say like, yeah, well, this isn't that and that's not that, and I don't have to make that connection. And
he's not the only director to have serious problems with this. I mean, it's well known that Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket, two of Kubrick's very fine films, have very bad cultures associated with
and I
them.
actually think this is what surprised me as I was rewatching these is because so far I feel like I've kind of made it sound like I've got no problem whatsoever with what Tarantino's finds. And I don't think that's quite true. But where I actually was surprised, I was kind of most offended as I was watching these, is because I don't think he's thinking through the effect it's going to have on the culture, is actually with Reservoir Dogs and with the character of Mr. Blonde. Mr. Blonde really troubled me as I was watching this, because I remember seeing in college the posters up of him in the sort of James Dean pose, or leaning against and saying, "Are you gonna? What's the line? Are you gonna
bite, little doggy? Or are you just gonna bark?"
Yeah, but he's a psychopath.
Yeah,
like he is not someone that we should be imitating at all. And it's almost like in that way, I feel like Tarantino, maybe it's because it was his first film and he hadn't quite found his footing with how to deal with the subject matter.
I think that's very true. On watching it, I disliked Reservoir Dogs a lot more.
Yeah,
than
it's
I did
actually,
before.
like I said, I don't have huge variations in how I feel about Tarantino movies, but I actually think I would maybe put Reservoir Dogs as my least favorite. But I think it has mostly to do with that Mr. Blonde character. He is kind of cool. I'll admit I was kind of cool. And then I was very troubled that I thought he was cool because there's nothing really redemptive about that character.
Well, I do think that was part of the point of Mr. Blonde. I only watched that for the first time very recently, and one thing that struck me is if you put Reservoir Dogs in line with things like Ocean's 11 and other heist movies where you're supposed to want to identify with the people in suits looking slick, looking cool, belonging to a group, having their specialties, you're supposed to want to identify with that, and it's sort of picaresque, I want to be like the villain thing. I thought that Mr. Blonde was supposed to be, in some ways, the reality check on that.
Yeah.
At least for a reflective person, I think that's a lot of the difference. You're supposed to look at that and say, I've been wanting to identify with these people now for so long, and now I'm shocked at what I wanted to identify with. And you're supposed to kind of reel away from that if you're watching it right.
Yeah, I agree.
It's the responsibility of the audience question coming back again.
Well, then maybe it's not necessarily Tarantino's fault, but that's certainly not what happened in the culture after that at all.
Yeah, again, like that's like the audience responding in the theater to Inglourious Basterds. It was out of his control.
Well, and one thing that I've thought of as we've discussed, this tension between enjoying these entertaining movies and yet acknowledging all the problems that we have with them. One concept that it brings me back to is the guilty pleasure. The question, the guilty pleasure is kind of a difficult category because generally I think you should like what you like, you should love what you love, and you shouldn't apologize for it. But when it comes to Tarantino, I do feel like I need to apologize for enjoying some of these things.
Yeah.
Because I have big problems with them, and yet I'm willing to go see them. And
I'm not going to stop seeing these movies. That's, I think, where it comes down to is even though we've had these issues, I'm going to go see the next Tarantino movie that comes out.
To me, Tarantino is the best example of a guilty pleasure in that I know that I'm going to see things that I disagree with, that I'm uncomfortable with. Django Unchained just grabs you and pulls you through the whole movie. It really makes you emotionally tied to everything as it goes along. It kind of shuts off reflection. I suppose where this leaves us is that when it comes to films like Tarantino's, there is good and there is bad, and it shows that it's important to approach cinema critically. That a large part of the problem and a large part of the resolution comes down to whether or not you're really thinking about what you're watching and guarding what you're allowing to come into your mind. Because there are reasons to watch Tarantino. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of what justifies him is going to come more from an aesthetic than a moral place. That there are things he does that no other director can, that we can't really display as well in a podcast. One thing I was thinking of this week is Tony Zhou did this interesting short clip on how to do visual comedy.
Yeah.
And he's specifically highlighting Edgar Wright. And I was thinking about that as I was watching Tarantino. Tarantino is one of the very best directors in using visual elements to convey his story. Long cuts, long shots on a character singing to herself in a car. Things that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a movie, but it's really pioneering what you can do with the visual elements of a movie as storytelling and breaking away from traditional dialogue-based exposition. Tarantino does that incredibly well, and there's a lot of merit to his film aesthetically, artistically, beyond the question simply of what he's writing in.
Yeah.
And I think if you approach Tarantino reflectively, and if you think about what you're allowing in, that you can really take away a lot of value from what he has to say.
Right. And even though we maybe didn't come to any serious conclusions here or change our minds definitively to say, this is what I think now, I think you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And, there is some good, although I would argue that there is no good in Death Proof, but that's neither here nor there. Let me get that last one in.
Jeez.
But, yeah, I think it was an important discussion. It's important to have these discussions among yourselves, not just, listen to other people have them. So,
with that said,
engage with us
Yes.
on the comments board of canwestillbefriends.net. Leave us a voicemail.
If you want to give us an email, feedback@canwestillbefriends.net. Reply to us on Twitter or Facebook. We just really want to hear what you think about Quentin Tarantino, what your experiences have been watching him, what makes you uncomfortable when you watch his movies, or what doesn't sit quite right with you, and what do you love about him? I mean, we want to hear both sides. If you think we said something that was absolutely obnoxious, please call us out on it. Maybe not too hard, but... Anyways, we want to hear from you. So, that's the different ways you can get in contact with us. Let me just throw out our number really quick if you want to give us a call. Give us a call and leave us a voice message. The number is 847-306-9532. 847-306-9532. And who knows, you might show up on a future episode of the podcast.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about what we're going to do in our next episode of Can We Still Be Friends?
Yeah, the next one, at the end of June... Criterion is releasing the Beatles movie Hard Day's Night for the first time for them. They've never released this one.
No.
And it's a classic movie that kind of transcended the traditional, band commercial movie. This is not Justin Bieber, Never Say Never. This is a movie that actually is really highly regarded among critics. I have seen it. I saw it a long time ago. Nate has not seen it, and he's a big Beatles fan. I am not a huge Beatles fan. Forgive me,
actually,
for underplaying it.
Pretty big.
Nate is the world's biggest Beatles fan, and I, up until recently, was not into the Beatles. So I'm gonna rewatch it. Nate's gonna watch it for the first time.
Right.
So that'll be it for next time. If you guys find that at your local library, watch it with us in preparation. But Tim, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have you.
Yeah, real pleasure.
Thank you for
having you come
having
in.
And I hope we have you back.
Yeah, as you always do, you manage to really synthesize the stuff that me and Ryan blather on about very well, and summarize things. So thanks so much for coming out.
Thanks a lot. And thank you guys for listening.
Appreciate it. Take care.